heard about it, and but then untold stories are also there. The untold stories about people who are really victims of the spousal of a cause for separate Tamil statehood and the Sri Lankan government, the sovereignty of Sri Lanka, as they call it. And the large number of reports written by international agencies, aid agencies, United Nations, and those states in Europe, such as Norway, who were very keen to intervene and ensure that peace prevails in Sri Lanka. These reports tell us a very, very tragic story of how when sometimes wonders as easy one can use the language of violence and engage in violence, so difficult it is to use what called the empathy side of human nature. To get into war is so easy, but to resolve conflicts of the post-war, how difficult it is. Why it is so difficult is a matter of consideration. Not because the human ability, or what's called the empathy of human nature, is wanting, but a wide range of self-induced called difficulties, when we use that term. Sometimes we know the reality, we know what can be done, what possibly can be done, but we are not very keen and sure we can take the next best step in the direction. And we call it politics of the day, and we call it the political reality. We give all kinds of names to these reluctances among human societies to move towards greater understanding and greater possible closer resolution of all these issues. And that's what's really happening in Sri Lanka today. Like, for instance, you have a small conflict in our own country on the question of language or reservation. And you all say, well, it's fine, they can handle it. But then you ask people, how do you're going to handle this question? We invent all kinds of possible reluctant, embargoes. And sometimes we create them. Sometimes we want to create them because we do not really want to work in that direction. And that's another part of, again, the difficulties of the non-angelic part of the human nature. But these are all part of realities of humanity. And then wherever you go, whichever civilization, whichever part of the world, and regardless of the rich heritages which are inherited from varieties of spiritual, religious, and other social traditions. So the Sri Lankan situation, as I study it today, was like, for instance, in South Africa, when they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in Sri Lanka also there is some effort being made in this direction. South Africa was a different story, and the ease with which and the great engagement with which the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission could progress, and also the South African constitutional stories were able to contribute to moving away from the apartheid regime, is a different story which perhaps cannot be and have not been so far put into practice in conflict areas like Sri Lanka. One has to look into are there any peculiar features such as religious and other features, ethnic features, which really prevent, which are so deep-rooted, and which must be so grappled with, and solutions to be done must be thought before we talk of a truth and reconciliation in Sri Lanka. But I think in my own understanding of international community talking about intervention in the internal domestic affairs of some other nation. If we are a part of a Sri Lankan community, we'll all be talking about, saying by finding fault with a political party, or B political party, or this government, or that president, or the other, and we have the freedom to talk about it. But we are the international community talking outside, talking from outside. And what can international community talking from outside can do in the most difficult of conflicts of another nation with all its sovereignty related issues? And that's a difficult question, but regardless of that, HRDA has been engaged in a wide range of discussions over the past number of years, whether it is Iran, Iraq, or workers in Dubai. Just look at any one of the issues where human beings struggling to hold on to dignity, liberty, autonomy, and the freedom to be what they want to be. So wherever they are, these issues will be different, the dimensions will be different, but the ultimate connecting threads are, why is it that, regardless of international human rights development, international human rights dialogues, which have virtually exploded in a big way and have virtually civilized the constitutional dialogues in different parts of the world. At the beginning of the century, when people began to experiment with constitutional rule, there were all kinds of constitutions in this world. There were socialist constitutions, liberal democratic constitutions, constituted without liberal democracy, but then they were constitutions all the same. But then today, we have a different constitutional momentum, which places the emphasis on individual human autonomy and the value of individual human autonomy and the ability to participate meaningfully in creating meaningful solutions to people's problems. And we give great credence to democracy and rule of law. So when a rule of law and democracy are the most cornerstones, important pillars of a constitutional dialogue all over the world today, regardless of all those what call dragging features in a given society or a community. So given all this, one wonders, why with all this? Why in a small country like Sri Lanka, which is not bogged down by other factors which may bog a huge country like India with its much bigger population, so on and so forth. Why is that in Sri Lanka this issue is not so easily resolved? It is a matter which requires deep consideration, and they read the recent efforts in the past 3-4 years of both the United States, the United Nations engagement, as well as other voluntary agents' engagement in Sri Lankan aid work, and the kind of partisan politics which, for instance, Tamil Nadu has played in this issue. You look at all that, I think what comes to your mind is that we need to move towards the ability to offer to the Sri Lankan nation as a whole, not really the Sri Lankan government, the Sri Lankan nation as a whole. The nation includes the civil society, the people who have been relatively away from the war-torn areas and who have never felt the pain of people who have become victims of war in a big way, and were kept away from all the engagement, the serious engagement of being a citizen of a country. I think the hallmark of being a citizen of a country is the ability, is the barometer, the ability to get engaged and be involved deeply, passionately in being able to resolve those issues where you have not been even a cause for those conflicts. It does not matter that I'm not in a cause for a conflict, but I'm in part of a resolution. That kind of an engagement, the civil society will have to be told, and how that can happen. It cannot happen through a mere local, domestic, partisan political dialogue. As I was watching the last statement made in the documentary, the minister takes, the gentleman says, well, the program's going on. And I don't think the Tamil war widows are any discriminatory set of people. But that's not a question. The question is not whether somebody is being discriminated. The question is, how do you find a holistic solution where the political forces, the governmental forces, and the civil society can realistically engage themselves as one common humanity. And that's a challenge. Now in that context, one of the major concerns it seems to be in Sri Lanka, after the conflict has ended, one of the major issues seems to be the livelihood resource support mechanisms. People have lost their lands. People have lost the ability to use lands which have been taken away from them. The land issue is one of the major issues as far as the war widows are concerned. Regardless of the fact whether they are Tamil war widows or widows who lost their husbands as part of the Sri Lankan army, or those who lost their husbands as part of a civilian conflict. Large number of civilians lost their lives merely for no good reason within the crossfires. Therefore, we're not talking about the distinction between who constitutes a war widow. All of them who lost their husbands and are not in a position to make a family, worthwhile, be able to be part of a family. Then I think that they are one composite class of people. In that context, therefore, the land issue seems to be a major issue. So there is one Center for Policy Alternatives in Sri Lanka, like several countries have Center for Policy Alternatives. The Center for Policy Alternatives have done a lot of reports and studies, like the Center for Ethnic, Center for Economic and Social Rights Center, like there's one great lawyer in Sri Lanka called Neelan Tiruchelvan, and whose center is still doing a lot of good work among the ethnic and conflict area. So these centers are beginning to talk about the land issue. But what came to me very strange was that when I asked somebody even today morning, a very leading law teacher in Colombo University, as to what the government's thinking on how to deal with the land question, he said, sir, only there are a lot of discussions on this issue. So how do we therefore, from being an international community, suggest to the Sri Lankan community, the Sri Lankan government, as to how we were able to handle this land question, and we were able to have a completely radically new thinking on creating and providing and sustaining a livelihood resource program through law and through community engagement. Is that possible at all? The Center for the United Nations said the responsibility to protect has been an evolving concept in international law. The responsibility to protect, there are several centers, like the Asia Pacific Center for the responsibility to protect. There is an international coalition of responsibility to protect. So there are regional conferences like this which work on the responsibility to protect. What is the responsibility to protect of a nation? It is not merely after a hostility has come into being. It's not merely after a problem has come into being that you try to protect. You try to prevent a conflict. You try to provide a justice system where a conflict has come into being. You try to enhance the quality of a justice dispensation system. All these are part of a responsibility to protect. But today, with all these associations, international conferences being there, I find that still on this basic question, why we need not think completely out of box thinking, completely differently. Is it possible to think on those lines? And if we are able to therefore think on the land and the livelihood foundation question differently, the next question would be, as I said, the Sri Lankan constitution is still on the issue of federalism. Like the Nepalese people are still trying to struggle. There are some vexed questions. And again, they are fought on very unorthodox, very old ways of thinking. Old ways of thinking and federalism and then linguistic conflicts and things like that. I think there is a need, of course, for international community to engage on looking at federalism from an entirely different angle. So that's again, as I said, is a very, very huge subject for a discussion like this. But these are issues which seem to be somewhat keeping people away from looking at the core issues, and then we fritter our energy on talking about the larger questions and we're not able to move anywhere. And that's what I found when we visit to Sri Lanka, talking to parliamentarians. We're all talking about the federal questions. And that's why I won't thinking on the subject of land issue and the ability to provide for a livelihood support base and a foundation, is that if only the parliament could enact a law which will say that human resource defined widely as possible, which may include land and any possible livelihood support foundation. If that human resource is now made available on a certain foundation, which will be less burdensome for the war widows. Today we find if a family has lost a son and a husband, the mother-in-law has a claim on a pension, the wife has a claim on pension, they have no other source for livelihood. See, the small conflict is probably the parliament, the Sri Lankan parliament can think rather differently and very in newer ways. So the land question, if I think it's possible to look at the land question from this angle, namely that in certain areas of Sri Lanka, wherever land does not, as of today, belong to private individuals, and even land which has been acquired over a period of time by governments for so-called public purposes, return all those lands as national resources for national reconciliation. Create a land bank for national reconciliation. And on that national reconciliation, we are able to create a land bank and then think of how to use this land bank as a conflict resolution methodology. I think it's possible to work. There are about, to the extent I have read, about 50,000 odd war widows in Sri Lanka. Compared to what happened in Iraq, it's about 1,79,000 people or widows in the Iraqi conflict. It's not a very big number, but the number is still huge for a Sri Lankan denomination. So if only, and then I also find that in the northern part of Sri Lanka, where the war-torn conflict area, you have about not less than 12,000 and odd hectares which are in questionable status. Either they are acquired by government over a period of time, public purpose, or the lands have been taken away by army, or they are just lying vacant because of a large number of conflicts about who owns this piece of land. So I suppose if this beginning is made, that we have these 12,000 and odd or 15,000 odd hectares of land, as a land bank for national reconciliation. I suppose that's a very, very important move that can be taken. And once you take that point, that departure, the point of departure, the next issue will be about how do you deal with the classification which still goes on. War widows, LTT war widows, civilian war widows, or the Sri Lankan war widows. I think that discrimination, or so-called discrimination and distinction, will have to slowly die unless we're able to move in that direction. After all, if the war is one common cause, widows are one common consequence. Like you can't say that we are a different set of people. So this dialogue is also equally important. When you go and talk to people, they are still caught in this so-called distinctions. How to relieve people from this painful distinction. That's a major task. The second issue on which international community can be very meaningfully involved, and how do we get involved? By being able to send periodically. There are a large number of new NGOs which are coming up in this area. There are a number of, for instance, Law Asia, which is the leading international lawyers group. This one of his chief patrons in Sri Lanka is deeply involved and engaged in these activities. Therefore, I think it will be possible to find out individuals and groups through whom we can connect very, very closely and effectively, and be able to translate his ideas and be able to share with them. If only you think that we are not on criticizing this president or that president or the other, I think that's not our job. So if only we are able to create a platform where people with good wishes and the ability to work and the willingness to be engaged seriously over a period of time. So human resource in investment from international community like this is the next third thing we can do. And one can go into those depths of the understanding of how to create a national land bank in Sri Lanka. For instance, I just gave it an idea. In the context of ethnic conflicts and internally displaced people, for the past 20, 30 years, United Nations have been talking about in so many ways. The IDPs, as they call it in different parts of the world, have also become a huge number for different reasons. Sometimes for economic reasons, development reasons, and when the Narmada displaced people were called the internally displaced people, or in Kashmir, lots of political questions which were raised. Are they really internally displaced people? When natural disasters displace people, are they really internally displaced people? These kinds of dialogues have virtually gone into questioning a very wise proposition evolved to be able to facilitate human thinking on addressing questions which never thought of in those dimensions. The very concept of an internally displaced person is to enable people who are removed far away from displacement to be able to little more deeply look into the displacement questions. To be able to look into them. The very fact that we are not looking into them is a sadder part of humanity. Therefore, the ability to look into those questions and the role which international human rights dialogues can play in facilitating, in persuading, in propelling people to think and get engaged in this situation. I think that's more important. Therefore, we can gather all those ideas like the IDPs and the international human rights contributions to these related issues and say how international community can move closer towards a small country like Sri Lanka, which needs a lot of friendly hands. It doesn't require criticism from outside. I don't think that any of us have the authority or the competence to say that, look here, what Rajapaksa did was something atrocious, and then stop talking about nothing more beyond that. If you're not able to do anything constructively, I suppose the better part of angelic part of human nature should remain, I think, quiet. I believe that if you're only able to contribute something more, reflect on that, you are part of a solution. Mere negative, critical reflection from an international community does not really offer any help to a community torn from inside. So these are some of the very random thoughts. And Gogna wanted me to come and talk about it. I told him, look here, I've not done a great study on the Sri Lankan question except my kind of involvement as a friendly person for a large number of years. And but then when you want to really talk about an issue seriously, when you get closer to them, you find how the reluctance dimensions of human nature are so obstructive. And you look at them closely, then you find, look here, what a problem it is. That's what I felt when I went to Sri Lanka this time. and you see hearing and reading from a distance is different. When you look closer and look at what people got say in their private conversations, what people got say in their private, relationships and transactions, that makes sense. And once you understand them, you understand, okay, oh no, the story is not correct, the story is not complete. We need to read the story, understand very, very differently. And that happens only when you keep your ears and eyes open for the untold stories of how people are reluctant to really solve problems. So this reluctance is the most, I think, the most important thing to tackle with. And how do you tackle with them is I think, is a big question. But as far as the individuals are concerned, who can probably spend time on reflecting, understanding the nuances of law and the failures and deficiencies of law in our own country and internationally and otherwise, and how to make more sense of a law and better law, good law, humane law, or a law which lives, not a law which really is made in parliament without voting, but a law which comes from out of human heart. This is the kind of a law we can talk about, and I suppose this is the kind of law we need to talk about. And I should therefore thank Mr. Gogna for calling me here. I came here primarily to share these very, very, very broad reflections. They may not have the content of a very deeply reflected understanding of the Sri Lankan war, post-war conflict. But I only want to say again, to repeat, I was reading a book called The Better Angels of Nature. The author says that we have moved far, far away from violence in civilization. 20th century, he says, documenting a whole range of history, he says that we have moved far, far away from violence. And what he says is that the whole range of instruments, human rights, constitution, fairness, empathy, and the new discoveries of human nature have all contributed to understanding and a greater emphasis on fairness in all human relationships. Different civilizations, our own country, with all its enriched civilizations and religion and spirituality, has talked about in different languages. They might have been lost over a period of time for a variety of reasons. Therefore, if somebody writing from a Western point of view can say that humanity has moved more away from violence and more into the angelic part of human nature, I think we as a nation can say certainly we have a lot more to contribute. And I'm sure we have that ability and the competence and the spiritual anchorage to say so, with an emphasis which no other part of the world can say. So I would probably end with these broad reflections, and we'll have a very fruitful conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Venkatramiji. The very great idea that no criticism, please come forward with the solutions. So we have with us Gautam Vikji, who is from Art of Living. This is the organization which for the first time got the opportunity to take up this post-war rehabilitation in Sri Lanka. And before we ask Mr. Vik to start, I'd like to welcome both Mr. Vik and Prasanna Chaturvedi. I'm inviting Amarji Blochanji, please come and welcome. Bhavna. मैं आलोक जी से रिक्वेस्ट करती हूँ कि वेंकट रमनी जी का मोमेंटो अमरजीत लोचन जी, गौतम विक जी का स्वागत। प्रसन्ना चतुर्वेदी जी रामानुजन ट्रस्ट के चेयरमैन है और एक ह्यूमन राइट एक्टिविस्ट, और बहुत ही क्षेत्रों में इन्होंने अपनी एकेडमिक कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन दी। तो मैं गौतम विक जी को आमंत्रित करती हूँ कि जहाँ वेंकट रमनी जी ने छोड़ा there has to be a resolution and a step forward for the rehabilitation. Please share with us your experiences as a rehabilitator.
जब तक ये फिगर आउट कर रहे हैं हम लोग, फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल कंग्रेचुलेशंस टू ह्यूमन राइट्स डिफेंस इंटरनेशनल। 7वां इंटरनेशनल कॉन्फ्रेंस है। हम लोग भी कॉन्फ्रेंसेस करते रहते हैं, तो बहुत इसके पीछे सेवा, बहुत श्रम, बहुत मेहनत जाती है। और कृष्णामणि जी को, हमारे ऑनरेबल कृष्णामणि जी, राजेश गोगना जी, सारे ऑर्गेनाइजर्स को और वॉलंटियर्स को बहुत बहुत शुभकामनाएं। हमारे प्रिय वेंकट रमनी जी ने बहुत विस्तार से श्रीलंका के सिचुएशन के बारे में बताया. इट्स अ वेरी कॉम्प्लेक्स सिचुएशन. हिंदी इंग्लिश दोनों में चलेगा ना? So it's a very complex situation. उसका कोई एक हल भी नहीं है और सिर्फ सरकारी पॉलिटिकली उसका सोल्यूशन निकले वो भी दिख नहीं पा रहा. हम लोग काफी साल से आर्ट ऑफ लिविंग काफी सालों से वहाँ पर हम लोग काम कर रहे हैं गुरुदेव के इंस्पिरेशन से 2004 से. तो 12 साल हो गए हमको वहाँ काम करते हुए. I'll just go through these slides. The Art of Living and Gurudev Shri Shri Ravi Shankar have been engaged in conflict resolution in Sri Lanka since 2004. This was the period when the ceasefire agreement between the government and the LTT was in effect. The tsunami disaster of December 2004 brought immense damage in terms of life and property. The Art of Living engaged in relief and rehabilitation work across the island. Both the LTTT and Sri Lankan government was crippled with the devastation. In 2005-06, both sides began preparing for a final offensive, which came to be branded as the Ilam War 4. This came to be the final phase of the war that concluded on May 18, 2009, with the defeat of the LTTE. Since 2004, Gurudev Shri Shri Ravi Shankar was deeply engaged in conflict resolution in Sri Lanka. He conferred with all stakeholders to the conflict, including members of the civil society. He had visited the country many times to instill mutual trust and confidence between the Sri Lankan government and the LTT to bring a closure to the civil war and take the path to peace and prosperity. In his continuing efforts to bringing peace in Sri Lanka, Gurudev Shri Shri Ravi Shankar visited Kilanochchi, the erstwhile LTTT's headquarters in September 2006. He helped facilitate the resumption of a dialogue and proposed a roadmap for lasting peace. In April 2008, the Art of Living and the International Association for Human Values co-organized a conference in Norway titled Peace and Reconciliation in South Asia, Challenges and Opportunities. The conference was attended by dignitaries from Europe, India and Sri Lanka and provided much hope and confidence for a peaceful resolution in Sri Lanka. In April 2009, when the conflict was nearing closure, in April 2009, Gurudev Shri Shri Ravi Shankar was the first spiritual leader to visit the several thousand displaced by war. He visited all the temporary refugee centers in Gogna district. He distributed clothes, drinking water, meals and prayed for their early return to their own homes. From July 2009 to December 2010, the Sri Lankan government requested Art of Living to deliver trauma relief programs for the internally displaced people, IDPs. Our teams delivered the 3-day stress and trauma relief modules with yoga, breathing technique, meditation and confidence building processes. जिसको हम Art of Living course कहते हैं. From July 2009 to December 2010, trauma relief programs and relief materials including food, clothes and drinking water delivered to over 85,000 internally displaced people. Rehabilitation centers covered were Omanthai, Chetikulam, Ardamadu, Vagunia, Jaffna, Trincomalee and Batticaloa. 2010 and 11, we focused on establishing schools. In 2010, established our second children's home in Batticaloa, district of Eastern Sri Lanka, to serve the war-affected and underprivileged children. 2011, we established a center in Arale village of Jaffna district to provide trauma relief and agricultural projects for the war-affected area. We've been conducting a lot of programs in the prisons of Sri Lanka. Several thousand ex-LTT cadres were placed in various prisons in Sri Lanka after the war. The Sri Lankan government specially invited us to deliver our stress and trauma relief programs in Boza prison. Boza prison is known to house the most hardened criminals from across Sri Lanka. there's a lack of photographs because as per our arrangement with the government, we were not allowed to click photos. But after this presentation, there's a short documentary which will, encapsulate all that, the visual effect. So over 2,500 ex-LTT cadres voluntarily participated in our programs over 6 months. The prison inmates were given a choice to participate and not made compulsory by the prison authorities. They started feeling the immediate benefits of the Art of Living trauma relief programs that spread the word amongst the inmates. The program became so popular that regular follow-ups sessions were arranged and are still going on. In 2012, we had the Interfaith Unity Program. The Interfaith Unity Program of music and dance was organized by the Art of Living in Colombo's largest stadium. To facilitate peace, harmony and friendship amongst the various religious and multi-ethnic people of Sri Lanka, more than 5,000 school children and students participated in this. A variety of cultural shows were featured to encourage people to appreciate and imbibe harmony and diversity. We also had a women's conference in Batikalawa district in eastern Sri Lanka.